There were a lot of things I learned in this book that I didn't know. It's a great history, and the first thing I didn't know is that this had its origins in the Vietnam War. So I want to talk about where we are now, but maybe you can uh, give us a sense of the evolution of the internet and how it was always tied to the surveillance state in the military.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think a lot of people don't really realize that the surveillance and influence, these are features that didn't just come to the internet recently, or even 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago when this technology first started kind of gaining traction. These functions, these features of the technology were built into the technology. I mean, they were the reason why they were created. And to understand that, I mean, we have to go back to the 1960s and to the 1970s, and really, yeah, to a kind of a new post-World War II world order where America was a global power. It wasn't the only power. It was facing off against the Soviet Union. Communism was a perpetual threat to the foreign policy establishment, to the business establishment of America. I mean, there was like the obsession, right, of the Cold War obsession. And so, but there was a problem in that a lot of the conflicts that America suddenly faced, especially after the Korean War, were not wars, where big armies were facing off against each other. These weren't like tank battles. It wasn't like troops marching in formation or anything like that. These were smaller wars, basically wars of liberation, of third world liberatory wars, where local populations were essentially rising up against their colonial overlords, right? And the U.S. was usually aligned with the colonial overlords of these countries, or backing them, or these were puppet regimes in some cases that were directly backed by either the old European colonial powers like France in the case of Vietnam, or America itself in South America. And so you have these populations, right? They're distributed populations all around the world. They're fighting wars that are kind of specific to their location. A lot of the fighters aren't in uniform. They're actually part of the civilian population. They are the population. And so what a lot of there was a new kind of way of thinking about how to fight these wars, and it was essentially a new doctrine, a counterinsurgency doctrine that was emerging in the 1960s. And it was the sense that we really can't fight these wars without understanding the population that we're dealing with. I mean, why are they rebelling? Why are some people rebelling and other people are not? What can we do to convince, maybe in a soft way, with aid or with other kind of economic programs, to tamp down dissent? And if that doesn't work, what kind of more tougher measures can we take in order to put down these uprisings? And so the internet came out of a very specific program that was initiated by a very new agency called ARPA, and the Advanced Research Project Agency, which was actually ARPA started out as NASA, as a kind of a pre-NASA agency that was then defunded and then reconfigured into a counterinsurgency agency under John F. Kennedy, under his administration. And it was essentially let loose on the Vietnam conflict to figure out, new technologies and new methods of trying to win this war in Vietnam. And so the agency did a lot of different things. For instance, developed drone technology to figure out how can we more effectively surveil the jungles. It developed Agent Orange. How can we prevent sort of the guerrillas that are attacking French and then American troops from using the jungle as cover, right, for their kind of raids and so, and part of that was also developing new ways of studying the Vietnamese population, its habits, its beliefs, its spiritual ideas, to try to figure out how to pacify these people, using psychological techniques and things like that. And so it funded ARPA funded all these anthropologists essentially to go out into the field and collect data. And there was so much data coming into the Pentagon from that there really wasn't a way of keeping it in one place to make it useful. So that was one thing. So there was a need to create data systems that could manage all this, what it was essentially surveillance data of these populations, right, and to process it, to extract something useful out of it. At the same time, ARPA was involved in a kind of a surveillance system in a different way. It was trying to track the movements of Vietnamese fighters on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Again, they were using jungle cover to hide, massive movements of troops, of supplies, and things like that. So they were trying to develop um, basically like spy devices that could listen, that could be dropped from the air, that could listen to what was going on the ground under the jungle cover, that could even smell, like smell, or human urine. If there were fighters peeing in the jungle, it would detect the urine and then send a signal to base, and then that location would be bombed from air. So there are all these different surveillance things that I was involved in, that were very practical to fighting the Vietnam War. But at the same time, there were people in America, back in the United States, that were thinking on a kind of a bigger scale, that were seeing that saw America as this global power. And you really can't be a global power in the modern age, overseeing all these different conflicts, without having some kind of bird's eye view of the entire globe, of knowing what's actually happening in the world. What are people talking about? What kind of political movements are sort of brewing in the various different locations in which America has an interest? And so they started kind of thinking about creating I don't know, to use today's terms, like an operating system for the American empire, an information system that could collect all this data and that could provide useful, meaningful information to the managers of the world, right? So it was like a kind of bureaucratic view of the American empire. And so these things essentially kind of merged together, these different streams merged together, and they birthed the ARPANET and various programs that were associated with the ARPANET. The ARPANET was this network technology that could connect different kinds of computers together in one network, which information could be shared amongst them. That was one part of it. The other part of it was to actually create computers that normal people could use. So people don't really know, but the operating system that we use for here, I have an Apple Apple MacBook here. The graphical user interface, the mouse, all these things, the menus, the drop-down menus, all these things were actually developed by the military as part of the ARPANET program. So part of it was to create this network that could connect computers, but also to create a new type of computer that could be easily used by regular people, not engineers, because before this kind of graphical user interface that we're all used to, computers were punch cards. You needed these technicians who would punch in data on these punch cards. They'd feed it into these vast computers, and then they'd produce some kind of data. So they were more like complex calculators rather than machines that you could interact with, that you could actually interface with in a natural way. And so that's the origin of it. I mean, the origin of the internet was about fighting insurgencies, about studying foreign populations, but also creating a platform that would allow America to run the world and to see the world, right? To make it transparent.
Well, let's talk about its domestic use, because it wasn't just used on fighters in Vietnam. It was used on anti-war activists in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know how it is. Anything that you deploy for use abroad, it immediately gets imported back into for domestic purposes, right? So almost immediately, this ARPANET technology was used to ingest information about activists against the Vietnam War, specifically, and what's interesting is, because a lot of the research that was part of the ARPANET program that created the internet was done at universities. Students actually knew quite a bit about these things, even in the late 60s. So,
well, you talk in the book about, I think it was students at Harvard, at
yeah.
MIT, saw where this was going and publicly protested.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was interesting to me writing this book and researching this book, because I went into the archives, at MIT, at Harvard, and looked at various declassified documents. And what was amazing to me is that students from the Students for Democratic Society at Harvard and MIT had a more complex and sophisticated critique of internet technology or network technology than people did in the Obama era. right? When because I was writing this book at the tail end of the Obama era, and so people still viewed internet technology as a liberatory technology, as a democratic technology, that the internet would create this global democratic village. I mean, people still believed that back then. People don't believe it so much anymore. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, why that is. But back then, not that long ago, people really did believe in the liberatory power of the internet. Meanwhile, of course, the internet is owned by these massive corporations, some of the wealthiest corporations on the planet. Of course, they work with the NSA, with the CIA, with the FBI. I mean, the relationship has been intertwined from the very beginning. But people believed it, right? People believed the kind of the marketing mythology of that these internet companies have pushed as part of their product. But in 1969 and 1968, when the first links were activated, right, of the ARPANET links, the first nodes were starting to work together. Already, students at these universities were protesting them. They were producing these very sophisticated pamphlets, trying to educate other students and other people about the danger that these technologies pose. And they said it outright. They said, "Look, these computer technologies, these network computer technologies that the ARPANET is, that the ARPA is trying to create, are tools of surveillance. They're tools of political control. They're designed to basically pacify political movements abroad, and are designed to pacify political movements at home." I mean, there was an incredible pamphlet that I discovered in the archives at MIT, and so the, because it was clear back then, I think, to people who were watching the emergence of computer technology, that computers were linked with power, because computers were controlled by uh, major corporations. I mean, they were very expensive to purchase. They were very expensive to run, and government agencies. So back then, people understood it wasn't an epiphany or anything like that. People understood that if you own a giant IBM computer, you're using it to crunch data. You're using it to crunch numbers. You're doing it to kind of extend the power over the organization that's using it, right? It's an extension of their power, and that the only people who could afford to use these things were very powerful entities in American society. And so the linking between power and computers and control and influence was obvious to, I think, even in the mainstream, in the American mainstream. I mean, you had like magazines like The Atlantic or something, doing front page stories about how computers are agents of surveillance and control and things like that. So it was understood back then, and essentially it has been forgotten. It was repressed, this history or this understanding, and it was people were propagandized to view computers in a totally different light, in a benign light, in a utopian light, which was not the case in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and even up into the 1980s. People still viewed computers with skepticism. I think things started to change in the 1990s when things started to get commercialized.
Well, you talk about that, and that was a very conscious effort to rebrand the internet. It wasn't an accident. But before we go on to the commercialization of the internet, I just want you to talk about what it was, these computer systems. You talked a little bit about that in Vietnam, but let's talk about like the anti-war activists. When I covered the war in El Salvador, they were using this system, and
Yeah.
anecdotally, I heard that they knew the names of every fighter in every single tiny guerrilla unit.
Yeah.
And they had charts,
Yeah.
and where they were from and this kind of stuff. But talk about the exercise of that knowledge and power.
I mean, look, there was a series of scandals in America during the sort of the Vietnam War era, where it was clear, it was found out that the U.S. Army was essentially running one of the most massive surveillance operations in the history of America, and probably, it's probably been eclipsed now with the internet, because the internet just automatically collects so much data. But back then, to collect data, you really needed to put people out in the field, right? And you needed to create files. People had to really, you need to have manpower to do this stuff, right? So they came up with. You probably remember this stuff. They posed as fake camera crews that would go and film, cover, anti-war protests, and then they'd actually produce
Well, you write
reels. And
about this in the book.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
But I
And
mean,
this,
but you also noted that they were sending all this back to, where was it, the Pentagon or somewhere, or the NSA. But as you said in the book, they could have just watched the evening news.
exactly. So I mean, essentially, the generals in the Pentagon had their own private TV network that was creating newsreels for them. But look, I mean, so surveillance was happening, right? But what I think there was a major escalation with this technology, with the ARPANET technology, and the ability of these new computers to ingest data and to make it accessible. That's, I mean, that's the key, right? Because you can have a lot of data. It's stored somewhere in on paper or in these punch cards. And really, if you're trying to get at trying to study, some kind of political cell, let's say, yeah, in Nicaragua or in Ecuador, if you're trying to study those things, you really need to make it accessible to regular people who are staffing, the Pentagon or the CIA. And so I think what was the major escalation with this technology is that you could take all that data that's being collected on, let's say, it's anti-war protesters or political movements abroad, and you could ingest it, and you could put them in essentially like an Excel kind of format, right? Like a database where things could be collated, things could be related. You could create relational maps between various individuals, all these things. So suddenly that data isn't just sitting somewhere and gathering mold in some basement, but it's actionable, right? So it's putting them at the fingertips of these bureaucrats, wherever they are, whatever state security agency they're in. And so I think that was the escalation. So, and there were some scandals in where, yes, it was even covered on TV. It was a major scandal where there was even a whistleblower who notified the press that this new technology, this ARPANET technology, was being used to digitize old surveillance data on anti-war protesters and make it accessible not just to the U.S. Army, which created, but share it with the FBI, with the CIA, with the NSA, and whoever, and even with the White House. So the ARPANET almost immediately uh, began to be used to spy on Americans. I mean, almost immediately. I mean, there was, I can't remember the exact dates. I think it was 1972 or 1973. ARPANET came online in 1969. So just a few years after this experimental, network came online, it was already being used to spy on Americans. Of course, the Pentagon denied it, said it didn't happen, that it was just an experimental thing, and all this stuff. But the fact is that they did digitize surveillance data, illegally collected surveillance data, which the Pentagon was actually legally mandated to destroy. In fact, it didn't destroy it; it digitized it and used this network to share it with all the security state agencies. So, from the very beginning, again, I think this is what's shocking to a lot of people who read my book, is that this wasn't something that happened when Google emerged, right? This wasn't something that happened with Facebook. This wasn't something that happened, with the NSA spying on us, as Edward Snowden revealed, right? Tapping into all these internet giants. Surveillance was there at the origin of the technology. I mean, surveillance was the reason why it was created. And I just to give it kind of an example, right? The first surveillance network technology was NORAD, essentially, right? So NORAD is this radar system that kind of watches the skies above the northern hemisphere, North America, to watch for enemy bombers, specifically Soviet bombers, and to intercept them if they enter American airspace. That was sort of why it was created initially, in response to the Soviet Union also developing the nuclear bomb. And I mean, so that is a kind of a surveillance network. So you're watching the sky, right? You're looking for people who cross the border or who are coming close in the sky, or planes that are coming close. And that is what sort of the managers of the American empire were hoping to recreate, but on a societal level, right? It's an early warning system for political threats, essentially, right? I mean, that's what kind of this ARPANET project came out of. That's the desire, that's the dream, that was the wish, the Christmas wish of theirs, right? To create for societies what NORAD or air defense systems created for airspace. And so if you think of it like that, then kind of the internet makes a lot more sense, because the internet has created that reality. I mean, we're talking right now on on this computer. I have my phone here. It's always with me. It's tracking me wherever I go. It's a personal radar, right? It could be used to listen in on this conversation if it wasn't public. We're completely bugged, right? Everything, like you said in your great introduction, everything that we do is surveilled. Like nothing is unwatched, and things could be correlated. Even if things that you don't say things could be inferred from your actions. One of the things that, I mean, even like, let's say Google or Apple can even know that you had a one-night stand purely by the movement of your, let's say, mobile phone. It could infer a lot of things. It can refer who you're friends with, who you meet with. It can map out your social networks very easily. I mean, we are fully transparent in that sense, right? And so, but that idea that Google and Apple and all these tech companies really brought into being with the commercialization of the internet and the wide adoption of these technologies was there from the inception.